The smoke rose thin and gray above the edge of Centralia, Pennsylvania on the morning of May the 27th, 1962, and no one who saw it felt afraid. It came from the old Bast colliery strip pit at the northern end of town, where the borough had been burning its landfill refuse for years. A cheap and common practice in coal country, unremarkable in the way that all maintained routines are unremarkable until the day they are not. The smoke drifted southeast on a light spring wind, crossing over rooftops where families were finishing breakfast, over a main street where the hardware store was opening its door, over the spire of St. Ignatius Church, over the yards of houses where children would be outside by mid-morning. Nobody called anyone. Nobody wrote anything down. The fire at the dump had been set before. It would be set again. It was the kind of thing that towns like Centralia managed without ceremony, without record, without the thought that any of it required documentation. The population of Centralia stood at roughly 1,100 people. The seam of anthracite beneath their feet had been accumulating energy for 300 million years. Those two facts had not yet introduced themselves to each other in any way the town could measure, but the introduction was already underway, moving at the pace of combustion through interconnected underground voids, traveling without light or witness through the dark, rational architecture of extraction that generations of miners had carved into the earth and walked away from. The fire moved the way all slow catastrophes move, not dramatically, not with warning, but with the quiet insistence of chemistry following its own rules. To understand how this never ended, you have to go back to 1854, to the surveyor Alexander Rea, who platted the town of Centralia on the slopes of Locust Mountain in Columbia County and gave it streets and lots, and the civic geometry of a place meant to last, not understanding, because no one in 1854 was positioned to understand, that the ground beneath his grid was already a machine, patient, fuel-rich, and waiting. The anthracite seam that ran beneath Centralia and the surrounding ridgelines was not one deposit, but a continuous geological formation, compressed plant matter from the Carboniferous period, transformed under heat and pressure into one of the densest carbon fuels on Earth. Seams ran at depths approaching 300 feet below the surface. Their thickness in the most productive sections measured in tens of feet, their lateral extent measured in miles. Coal had made this region and everything in it, the roads, the churches, the wage structure, the population itself, and the first mine operators who arrived behind Rea to lease the land and sink shafts into Locust Mountain were not extracting a resource so much as tapping a reservoir of chemical energy that had no modern equivalent for concentration and density. The industrial pressure driving them was absolute. Railroads needed fuel, foundries needed fuel. The heating systems of every eastern city needed fuel, and anthracite burned hotter and cleaner than any bituminous alternative. That arithmetic drove every decision that followed for the next 80 years, and it drove them without hesitation, because hesitation cost money, and money was what the seam was for. The method they used to extract it was called room and pillar mining, and it was a system of deliberate, controlled incompleteness. Miners would cut horizontal galleries into the seam, carving out rooms typically 20 to 30 feet wide, leaving standing columns of coal, pillars, to support the roof above. The rooms were the product, the pillars were the sacrifice. What this method created, over decades of continuous operation beneath Centralia, was a three-dimensional void network, chambers and corridors extending for miles in every direction beneath the streets and houses and churches that the town built above, a subterranean negative space that mirrored the town's footprint in absences rather than structures. Pennsylvania mine inspectors recorded the expansion of these workings in annual bureau reports that grew thicker each decade, cataloging footage of new gallery, tonnage extracted, workforce employed, accidents logged, a meticulous institutional portrait of an industry consuming itself from below. The inspectors walked the working faces with their lamps and their notebooks, measuring gas concentrations and roof stability, producing reports that described a controlled industrial environment. That description was accurate. The control was real, and it was sustained by a system of engineered ventilation that threaded the entire underground network with moving air. Into those voids, mine operators drove ventilation shafts. This was not negligence, it was engineering. Coal mines produced methane and carbon monoxide in concentrations that killed men, and the only way to manage those gases was to move air through the workings continuously. Shafts sunk from the surface to create intake and exhaust circuits, keeping the atmosphere breathable, keeping the men alive. The ventilation infrastructure of the Centralia mines was rational, necessary, and professionally designed. Mine engineers of the era understood airflow calculations, understood the relationship between shaft geometry and circulation volume, understood the dangers of a stagnant underground atmosphere. They solved the problem correctly. Every man who descended into those workings and came back up alive was evidence that the solution worked. It was also, as a consequence of its function, a permanent oxygen delivery system threaded through miles of coal-lined tunnels. No one in the 19th century needed to think about what that would mean if the coal ever ignited from below, because no one imagined a scenario in which ignition from below was possible. The ventilation shafts faced upward toward daylight and safety, and the danger they were designed to prevent was gas accumulation, not fire propagation. That was the first twist. The mine was engineered to be the most controlled, most systematically managed environment in the industrial operation, regulated airflow, regulated extraction, regulated roof support, and the very precision of its design created the mechanism by which, one day, a small surface fire would become an inextinguishable underground catastrophe. The ventilation shafts that had kept generations of miners breathing would keep the fire breathing instead. The system worked perfectly. It worked for the fire. By the early 20th century, the mines beneath Centralia had begun their long decline. Anthracite demand peaked and then softened as oil and natural gas captured the home heating market, and one by one the major collieries reduced their workforces and closed their operations. The voids they left were not filled. Filling them would have cost money that produced no coal, and the legal and regulatory framework of the era imposed no such requirement. The underground network simply went dark and silent, its pillars slowly compressing under the weight of the overburden, its ventilation shafts open to the surface, its vast coal-lined chambers cooling to the ambient temperature of the earth around them. Above ground, Centralia continued. Families raised children in houses whose foundations sat over rooms emptied of everything that had once made them structurally rational. By mid-century, the town held a population near its historical peak. Churches, a borough council, a main street, the ordinary continuity of a working-class American community with a collective memory that grew shorter each generation regarding what lay below. Census records from the 1940s and the 1950s show a stable, if slowly declining population. These were people who knew the mines had closed, but who experienced the closure as economic loss, not geological consequence. The ground felt solid underfoot. It had always felt solid. That sensation, unremarkable, repeated daily across a lifetime, was doing its own quiet work, erasing the memory of the underground, making the void network into abstraction, into history, into something that no longer needed to be thought about. When the last miner left, the mine did not leave with him. In the late 1950s, the borough faced a mundane sanitation problem. The old Bast colliery strip mine pit at the edge of town had become the community's informal landfill. By 1961, it was filling beyond its useful capacity. The standard solution in small Pennsylvania coal towns at the time was open burning, set fire to the accumulated waste, reduce its volume, and continue using the site. Borough Council records from that period document the decision with the brevity of routine. The pit needed clearing, burning was the method. The fire was authorized and set on or around May 27, 1962. The name of the council member who signed off on it sits in those minutes with all the weight of an ordinary administrative act, which is precisely what it was: bureaucratic, economical, and unremarkable because it had been done before in that pit, in that town, without consequence. What made May 27, 1962 different from every previous burn was the connection. The Bast colliery pit was not an isolated surface feature. It was a former strip mine cut into the same coal formation that the underground works had been following for decades. And at some point along its perimeter, the pit communicated with the abandoned underground workings. The fire set in the garbage communicated with the coal communicated with the ventilation network, and the ventilation network, as it had been designed to do, moved air. Anthracite does not ignite casually. It requires sustained heat to reach its combustion threshold. But once it ignites, it burns at temperatures approaching 925 degrees Celsius, nearly 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit, and in a semi-sealed environment with adequate air supply, it sustains itself through its own radiated heat, preheating the coal ahead of the fire front and moving through the seam the way fire moves through any fuel-rich, oxygen-sufficient medium, steadily, invisibly, without announcement. Bureau of Mines investigators who examined the Centralia site in the weeks and months after May 1962 produced reports noting smoke and elevated temperatures at surface points. But the institutional language consistently framed the situation as a surface fire problem with possible underground extension, not as an underground fire that had already escaped any practical means of control. The distinction was not merely semantic, it determined the scale of response, the budget allocated, the urgency assigned. The report said the fire was manageable, the earth said nothing, but it continued to burn. The first formal remediation attempt came in 1969, 7 years after the initial ignition. A trench was excavated to create a fire break, a physical barrier of non-combustible material intended to starve the fire of fresh coal. The cost was modest, and the approach was logical by the engineering standards of surface fire management. The fire went around it. The underground void network provided pathways for the fire front to move laterally, circumventing the trench geometry entirely and continuing into the seam on the far side before the intervention could be completed or extended. Engineers who reviewed the failed trench in subsequent assessments noted that the excavation had been designed for a fire of known and limited extent, and that the actual fire was neither. Subsequent attempts followed similar patterns, targeted and underfunded, designed for a fire whose true dimensions were never fully mapped, because mapping them comprehensively would have cost more than the annual budget for the entire remediation program. Each failure incrementally raised the estimated cost of a comprehensive solution without generating the political will to fund one. State representatives brought the issue to Harrisburg and then to Washington with increasing urgency through the 1970s. But urgency without appropriation produces reports, hearings, site visits, and new cost estimates, not extinguishment. Office of Surface Mining officials tracked the Centralia situation as one chronic problem among many, filing assessments that documented the fire's growth with scientific precision and recommended solutions that never received their required funding. Every remediation was designed for the fire they could see, none was designed for the fire they could not. The first indication visible to ordinary residents came not from a government report, but from a gas station thermometer. In 1979, John Coddington, who owned a service station on Centralia's main commercial strip, noticed that his underground fuel storage tanks were registering temperatures far above normal, nearly 180 degrees Fahrenheit in the fuel itself, heat conducted upward from the coal fire moving through voids beneath his property. He called it in. State health officials arrived and tested the air and soil gases around the site, finding carbon monoxide concentrations at levels that, in enclosed spaces, could render a person unconscious within minutes and kill within an hour. The threshold for incapacitation by carbon monoxide is approximately 200 parts per million with sustained exposure, and levels recorded in structures near the active fire front exceeded that threshold in enclosed basements and crawl spaces during certain atmospheric and pressure conditions. Residents living above the fire's path had been breathing compromised air, in some cases for years, without any official notification that the air required monitoring. The fire had been burning for 17 years before anyone measured what it was doing to the people living above it. Health advisories were issued, monitoring programs were established, and still the fire burned, indifferent to the administrative response it had finally provoked. Valentine's Day 1981 made abstraction concrete in a way that no inspection report had managed. Todd Domboski was 12 years old when the ground opened beneath him in his grandmother's backyard in Centralia, a sinkhole roughly 4 feet across at the surface, dropping approximately 150 feet into a void where carbon monoxide concentrations later measured above 1,000 parts per million, nearly 5 times the level capable of causing rapid loss of consciousness in an adult. Domboski grabbed exposed tree roots at the edge of the collapse and held himself there, suspended above a lethal underground atmosphere, until his cousin pulled him to safety. The wire service photograph of the steam and gas venting from the open sinkhole traveled to every major newspaper in the country. Congressional offices received it the same day. The story that accompanied it was not framed as a local administrative matter, but as an indictment. A town had been sitting on an underground inferno for 19 years, while state and federal agencies produced reports, attempted cheap fixes, and moved on to the next budget cycle. The second twist was embedded in that photograph. The sinkhole was not a new development. It was not a sudden escalation. It was the predictable, physically inevitable consequence of a process that had been underway since 1962, the coal burning away the structural material supporting the overburden settling incrementally toward the expanding void, the surface thinning from below until the last insufficient layer gave way on a February morning in a 12-year-old's path. Geologists had described this mechanism in the technical literature. It required no unusual conditions. It required only time and the continuation of a fire that had been burning and growing for 19 years without adequate response. Domboski's survival was extraordinary. That his survival was required at all was not. Congressional hearings in 1981 and 1982 received testimony from Office of Surface Mining officials, state regulators, and engineering consultants who had studied the Centralia situation in detail. The numbers they produced ended the remediation debate without anyone declaring it over. A comprehensive excavation removing the burning coal and contaminated overburden, filling the voids, and restoring structural integrity to the subsurface beneath an inhabited community would cost in the vicinity of $660 million by the estimates circulating through federal budget offices. That figure appeared in appropriations discussions and was not appropriated because no political constituency existed for spending that sum on a town of 1,100 people when the alternative was to move the people and abandon the ground. The fire's perimeter had expanded to cover an area that continued to grow with each new thermal survey, its boundary advancing through the seam in the direction of greatest coal continuity, following the geology with the complete indifference of any chemical process following the path of available fuel. The arithmetic of remediation versus relocation was resolved the way all such arithmetic is resolved in public administration. The cheaper option was selected, documented with procedural thoroughness, and implemented. The federal government, through the Office of Surface Mining and in coordination with Pennsylvania agencies, offered Centralia residents a buyout. Between 1984 and the early 1990s, the physical fabric of the town was systematically removed. Homes were purchased and then demolished. Streets were officially vacated. Utility connections were severed. The grid that Alexander Rea had platted in 1854, the streets named and numbered, the lots surveyed and bounded. The civic infrastructure of a community designed to persist was reduced to empty parcels, cracked sidewalks leading nowhere, fire hydrants standing in overgrown lots connected to water mains that no longer served any structure. This was a deliberate erasure of place. Property transfer documents in Columbia County recorded the transaction with bureaucratic thoroughness, listing parcel numbers, assessed values, transfer dates, and acquisition costs. A meticulously maintained ledger documented a town being purchased and disassembled one property at a time. The record showed an almost surgical level of precision. David Dacock, the journalist whose 1986 book on the Centralia fire documented the institutional history of its mismanagement across 2 decades, observed what the relocation records revealed about government capacity. The same administrative system that had failed to fund a $66 million remediation in 1969 had failed to fund progressively larger interventions through the 1970s and had failed to prevent a sinkhole from nearly killing a child in 1981, was perfectly capable of generating precise and timely documentation of every property it acquired, every structure it demolished, and every family it relocated. The twist was in that precision. The government knew, to the dollar and the date, what each house was worth and when each family departed. It tracked the physical erasure of a community with the efficiency of an agency that understood asset liquidation. It did not bring comparable precision to the question of what was burning beneath the assets or how to stop it. The institution measured everything except the thing that mattered. A small number of residents refused to go. John Lokaitis Jr., who served as caretaker of St. Mary's Ukrainian Orthodox Church, one of the last standing structures in the borough, remained after the buyout was complete, maintaining the building against the slow encroachment of weeds and silence. He lived in a place that no longer functioned as a town, but that he would not leave because it was his and had been his family's. Others stayed for reasons preserved in fragments by oral history collections and newspaper profiles, attachment to the specific ground, distrust of the government's valuation, and the refusal of people who had spent their lives in a place to be administered out of it by an agency that had first failed to protect them and then offered to buy their silence. The United States Postal Service revoked Centralia's zip code 17927 in 1992. In 2002, Governor Tom Ridge signed the order authorizing eminent domain seizure of all remaining privately held properties in the borough. That legal mechanism transferred title to the state, while the remaining residents pursued court challenges that extended the legal contest for years afterward. The streets of Centralia were now state property. The fire beneath them remained beyond the state's practical reach. The government that could not stop the fire stopped the town instead. And the town, having no legal infrastructure left to defend itself with, gradually ceased to exist as anything a map could describe with confidence. Historian Joan Quigley, whose 2007 examination of the Centralia fire traced the human cost of the institutional failures that allowed it to grow unchecked, described a community whose dissolution had been accomplished by paperwork, zip code revocations, eminent domain filings, utility disconnections, demolition permits, a bureaucratic erasure so thorough that the place appeared from the outside to have been handled. Thermal imaging surveys conducted in the years following the relocation told a different story. The fire's underground extent, mapped by USGS, and affiliated researchers using infrared imaging and gas sampling covered hundreds of acres of subsurface coal formation, its boundaries still advancing, still following the seam, still sustained by the ventilation network that 19th century engineers had installed to protect the men working the same tunnels the fire now occupied alone. Surface temperature anomalies appeared in the imaging data at multiple points across the former borough footprint. Gas vented from cracks in the abandoned pavement of Route 61, the highway that had once carried traffic through the center of Centralia and now carried nothing through the center of a field. Some geological assessments placed the fire's potential duration in the range of centuries, a projection that reframed every human response to the fire, every trench, every hearing, every relocation check written and deposited as a brief, unsuccessful intervention in a process operating on a timescale that had nothing to do with budget cycles, election calendars, or human lifespans. The fire did not need management. It needed only what it had always had, the oxygen supply threaded through the underground by the rational engineering of men who had wanted to keep miners alive, and the coal that 300 million years of geological process had deposited beneath Locust Mountain before the first European surveyor arrived to draw lines across it. The smoke still rises from cracks in the pavement of Route 61, which leads now into a grid of empty streets where the only evidence of the town is the occasional fire hydrant standing in an overgrown lot, connected to nothing, painted in the fading colors of a municipal system that no longer exists. The ground beneath it registers temperatures that no inhabited ground should register. Carbon monoxide vents from its surface and is measured periodically and recorded in reports that go to offices where no remediation is being planned because no remediation is being funded, because no remediation at any price that has ever been discussed would address a fire that has been burning for more than 60 years through a seam system whose full connectivity has never been completely mapped. The fire has no schedule, it has no deadline, it is not waiting for a decision, a budget, or a political consensus. It is simply burning through the architecture of its own fuel supply, following the seam in the direction the seam goes, sustained by the air that the mines were built to provide, indifferent to the zip codes and property records and eminent domain orders accumulated in Columbia County filing cabinets. Alexander Rea platted a town above it in 1854. The miners cut it open for decades. A borough council set a match to a garbage pit on a spring morning in 1962. Each of those decisions was rational. Each was documented. Together, they were irreversible. The energy stored beneath Locust Mountain has been releasing now for more than 60 years. It will not stop when we stop watching. It will stop when the coal runs out. No one knows when that will be.